Their journey would become legend. 45 men, later guided by a Native American woman, traveled a total of just over 8,000 miles, helping open new territory for a young nation. Remarkably, only one man would die on this voyage. More remarkably, though basically a military expedition, it had its points of democratic decision-making. When they returned to civilization, the leaders would become national heroes, Meriweather Lewis and William Clark. But just 3 years later, Lewis would die a violent death, a death that many still believe has unanswered questions. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the mysterious death of Meriwether Lewis, an explorer, governor, and hero whose death shocked the nation. And while many believed the death to be suicide, others questioned if Captain Lewis was the victim of an attack. If he was murdered, then the question is, who had reason to kill the famous explorer? France was in trouble, fighting a costly war in Europe and watching their colony of Haiti slip away. They were in need of money fast. President Jefferson of the United States was interested in the port of New Orleans, gateway to the North American interior. While Jefferson had his questions about the constitutionality of the government buying territory, and his political enemies could use it against him, once offered the whole of Louisiana territory at a bargain price, he couldn't say no. Yet, when the United States made the purchase in 1803, there were some serious questions as to what they had actually bought. Now, here, some people claim that Jefferson thought there might be dinosaurs out west. Dinosaur discovery was something pretty new. I've also heard some historians say that Jefferson thought there were woolly mammoths living in the American frontier. I don't know how much of that holds water, but it was definitely a mysterious land out there. And on most maps, the interior of the United States, or I should say the interior of North America, was blank. They had no idea what was really out there. One question was, did the Missouri River, a tributary of the mighty Mississippi, connect to the fabled Northwest Passage? Something Europeans had been seeking since the time of John Cabot. What other valuable treasures lay in the vast expanse that was Louisiana? To answer these questions and to give the United States a toehold in the Pacific Northwest, Jefferson would send the Corps of Discovery expedition to map and study the northern Louisiana Purchase and push on to the Pacific Northwest. The two men selected to lead the expedition were Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. While Clark technically outranked Lewis, the two were largely equals and seen as more co-leaders on the expedition. The Corps included 40 additional men, including York, an enslaved man who belonged to Clark. While on the journey, York was actually treated as a free man and even given a vote in decisions made by the court. The official report of the expedition made it clear that he was a valuable member, and like many of the members, enjoyed the company of a great deal of native women while traveling across the country. Upon return, York and Clark had a disagreement as to whether or not York had actually earned his freedom. Of course, legally, Clark's opinion was the only one that mattered. York would eventually be freed 9 years later. While the denial of York's freedom was surely a crime, at least by any decent standards, it's not the crime we're looking at today. Once in Mandan country, they were introduced to a French trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, who would act as a translator for the court. But it was his wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who would prove to be an invaluable addition to the mission's success. Despite probably being only 16 years old at the time, like York, she was given a vote in the decisions made by the courts. What makes this even more insane is that she also had a child just as she joined the expedition. Clark actually called Sacagawea Janie and the baby Pomp or Pompey. It would be Sacagawea who would help guide the expedition to the Columbia River, also acting as an interpreter. Sacagawea would die in St. Louis at the age of 24, 6 years after the completion of the expedition. Clark then adopted her son Pompey, whose actual name was Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, who was born on the expedition, and her daughter, Lizetta. Their father signed over custody in 1813, the year after Sacagawea's death. It appears from the record that the girl probably died in childhood, but Pompey would have an extraordinary life of his own as an Army scout, gold miner, explorer, and even a guest of European royalty before his death at the age of 61 in Danner, Oregon. As for the expedition's leader, they were the 1806 equivalent of rock stars, mixed with astronauts. However, Jefferson spent more of his time in his address to Congress about the expedition trying to justify the cost. It was also taking far too long for the duo to publish the accounts of their journey. And once published in 1814, the editor left out key important discoveries. It wouldn't be until the publication of their journals 100 years later that the extent of their scientific discoveries were known. By that time, many of their discoveries have actually been rediscovered and credited to somebody else. Clark would serve in various government positions after the expedition and helped develop numerous treaties with Native Americans. While always an expansionist, Clark did seem to possess some empathy towards Native Americans and had hoped they could preserve their culture by removing themselves from white society. At times, he was criticized for showing too much compassion towards Native people. He would lead the Western military campaigns in the War of 1812 and was finally awarded with the governorship of the Missouri Territory in 1816. In 1822, he was named Superintendent of Indian Affairs, which was later renamed to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He held that position till his death in 1838, which meant he was in charge during the enforcement of the Indian Removal Act and what would become known as the Trail of Tears. And while the end of his life is marked with some troublesome events and maybe even crimes against humanity, he did meet with both great personal and professional success after the famed expedition. His partner, Meriweather Lewis, would not be as lucky. By all accounts, Lewis should have been happy. He was a national hero. He had been granted 1,600 acres of land for his part in the expedition. His friend, President Jefferson, had appointed him territorial governor of Upper Louisiana Territory. He had negotiated treaties with Native American tribes. His work to enforce treaties seemed aimed at the protection of their native lands to the west. His administration had mixed results, and there were questions about his expenditures. He would end up in a conflict with Frederick Bates, the territorial secretary. Bates was creating issues between Lewis and the federal government. Bates had started to conjecture that Lewis had personally profited from a mission to return the Mandan chief Shehikek to his tribe. Shehikek had traveled with Lewis and Clark on their return journey in order to meet Jefferson. This was done with the understanding that they would then aid in his return. Because of a conflict between native tribes, it would take 2 expeditions and tens of thousands of dollars to finally get him home. When Bates started conjecture about Lewis making a profit from these missions, the War Department refused to reimburse Lewis for the funds he had personally paid for the expedition to return the chief. When news reached Lewis's creditors that he was out on a large sum of money, they called in his loans. Additionally, Congress had begun to question some of the expenses of the Corps' expedition. This could lead to Lewis having to repay those expenses. Also, Lewis seemed less than satisfied with the results of the expedition. While most thought the expedition as a success, he viewed at least parts of the journey as far from successful. He was bothered by the fact that they had never found the Northwest Passage. The trading posts that they had established along the Oregon Trail were also faltering. In the fall of 1809, Lewis decided that he would journey from St. Louis, where he was acting as governor, to Washington, D.C., in order to set aside some of these questions. He started his trip floating down the Mississippi with the plan of sailing from New Orleans to Washington. He changed his mind and disembarked, traveling over the Natchez Trail. In September at Fort Pickering, Lewis reportedly started to act erratic. Captain Gilbert Russell, commander of the fort, reported that Lewis made 2 attempts to take his own life and had to be restrained for his own safety. Quote, his condition rendered it necessary that he should be stopped until recovered, which I have done. Unquote. Russell also stated that Lewis was exhibiting mental derangement. Lewis was able to continue on the Natchez Trail to Grinder's Stand. Lewis was accompanied by John Pernia, a free African American who served as his personal servant, and John Neely, a federal agent. Neely separated from Lewis and Pernia to look for some missing horses on the morning of October 10th. Lewis and Pernia then came to an inn run by Priscilla Grinder and her husband Robert. Robert, who was said to be absent when Lewis arrived. Lewis was given a one-room cabin to stay in for the night, while Pernia would sleep in a hayloft in the barn in order to keep track of the horses. Miss Grinder reported that Lewis seemed agitated at dinner that night. According to statements given by Mrs. Grinder, and these are hearsay at best with no official investigation ever took place, Lewis was pacing back and forth, talking in an animated manner. She was concerned about her guest and had trouble falling asleep. At around 3 o'clock, she heard 2 gunshots. Then Lewis yelled for water and for her to tend his wounds. She ran to his cabin just before Pernia arrived, who was sleeping in a barn loft about 200 yards away. Lewis was gravely wounded with a gunshot to his head and a second to his chest. The head wound didn't seem to be bleeding very bad, although the chest wound was bleeding heavily. How bad the wound was seems to be a matter of debate. Some sources claimed it was non-fatal, not penetrating the skull. Others claimed that part of the skull had actually been removed and the brain was visible. The latter seems unlikely, as Lewis was able to speak and walk around after being shot. Her story changed at least 3 times. In a second account, she says that Pernia didn't arrive until later, and when he did arrive, Lewis asked that Pernia finish him off with his rifle. It was also reported in some accounts that Lewis had also slashed himself multiple times with a razor after shooting himself. In a later account given to a writer recorded in 1845, Mrs. Grinder adds some important details. In this version, she said that just before sunset, 2 other men came to the inn. Lewis confronted the men with his pistols, challenged them to a duel if they didn't leave. The men left, saying they would find lodging at another location about 5 miles down the road. In this rendition of the story, she also heard at least 4 shots fired. She said one startled her awake, then 2 more, a pause, and then a fourth. She also states that she asked Pernia to get Lewis's pistols away from him due to his agitated condition, but Pernia replied that Lewis had no ammo for his pistols. Furthermore, she claims that Pernia and Lewis had switched clothes sometime before the shooting. Without any investigation, Meriwether Lewis's death was ruled a suicide. The body was not examined until 1845. That year, they set out to erect a marker over his grave. In doing so, they exhumed the grave and said it looked like he died from an assassination, not self-inflicted wounds. Now, this was 1845. There was no forensics, so just what they base their conclusions on is pretty unclear. Some people are even today calling for the body to be exhumed again and have modern scientific forensics applied to answer the question whether it was suicide or assassination. Now, not being a scientist, I have no idea if any evidence would still exist over 200 years later. But we can look at the possibilities of how Lewis died by looking at his life leading up to his death. While in financial trouble and prone to bouts of depression, Lewis was also suffering from malaria. In the late stages, malaria is known to cause cognitive disabilities, depression, and violence. Before leaving St. Louis, the explorer also updated his will and made arrangements for friends, including William Clark, to sell his property to pay off his debts. Both President Jefferson and William Clark made mention of Lewis's depression. It was also well recorded that Lewis could fly off the handle. In fact, it was his temper and a series of bar fights as a young man that caused him to be transferred to the command of William Clark, starting their lifelong friendship and later partnership. He had always been the more unpredictable of the two. Clark even wrote Jefferson saying he worried about their mutual friend's mental health, all of which tends to support the conclusion of suicide. But as time passed, other news came to light. At this point in our story, we have to introduce James Wilkerson. Wilkerson has his own wild and interesting history. A hero of the Revolutionary War, governor of northern Louisiana before Lewis, the man who betrayed Aaron Burr, and later a proven traitor and, according to some people, the possible assassin of Meriweather Lewis. Wilkinson had performed great heroics during the Revolution and was trusted by every president from Washington to Madison. This despite the fact that many rumors floated around that he was spying for the Spanish government, an accusation that was proven true after his death. Among the information Wilkerson leaked to the Spanish was the Lewis and Clark expedition. The expedition was actually conducted in secret. A commanding general in the U.S. Army was privy to the information. He not only passed information to Spain, but urged Spain to send forces to stop Lewis and Clark, which Spain did, but in the vastness of Louisiana territory in the Pacific Northwest, Spain failed to locate the corpse. Now, it should be noted here that the other famed explorer, Zebulon Pike, who was exploring southern Louisiana territory and northern New Spain or Mexico, was intercepted by the Spanish accused of spying before he was able to make it back to the United States. Wilkerson also became heavily involved in Aaron Burr's plot to form his own nation. Being governor of northern Louisiana and an experienced military leader, Burr recruited Wilkerson as part of his plan. As the plot started to fall apart, Wilkerson turned on Burr, informing President Jefferson of the conspiracy. Wilkerson produced key documents implicating Burr. The documents were, however, altered to lessen Wilkerson's own personal involvement. Even with the doctored evidence and self-serving testimony of Wilkerson, he was almost indicted as a co-conspirator by grand jury. Later, Burr would be acquitted, but the whole affair had damaged Wilkerson's reputation. Wilkerson continued as governor of the territory until criticism of his administration caused him to be replaced by Meriweather Lewis. Just following the death of Lewis, John Neely came upon the scene, catching up after their separation from the day earlier. Neely supposedly wrote a letter to Jefferson detailing Lewis's death. The letter was later shown to be a forgery. The letter seemed to have been written by John Braham, who then wrote his own letter, nearly identical to Jefferson, to inform him of Lewis's death. So John Braham wrote two letters, but signed Neely's name on one of those, both of them giving his version of Lewis's death to President Jefferson. Now, here you need to understand that Braham was a business associate of Wilkerson's. Both were making large sums of money off of land speculation in the territory. Neely, who had joined Lewis only after he left the boat, switching to an overland route, seems tied to Wilkerson also. There are even questions about the authenticity of the accounts by Gilbert Russell of Lewis's attempts to take his own life. It is clearly possible that a conspiracy was put into play to kill Lewis and make it look like suicide. But why would they do this? Lewis believed the rumors about Wilkerson selling secrets to the Spanish. When he left St. Louis, headed to meet Jefferson, he took with him several boxes. They included his personal items, journals from the expedition, and papers to clear his name in some of the financial matters that were plaguing him. The journals were being taken for publication. The other papers were going to be presented to remove the possible crippling debt that Lewis was facing. When the papers were retrieved and brought to Jefferson by a man, again with close ties to Wilkerson, they were in disarray as if somebody had searched them. This caused some to speculate that Lewis had uncovered damning information about Wilkerson. If Lewis had possessed information proving Wilkerson was spying for Spain, it would clearly be worth killing over. Even if Wilkerson could somehow avoid treason charges, his reputation and fortune would be wiped out. Others believed that Mr. Grinder acted on the orders of Neely or Brian and was paid by Wilkerson. Neely had given directions for Lewis to travel to Grinder's stand when the two split up on October 10th. Then there were the two men that Mrs. Grinder said showed up just before sunset on the night Lewis was killed. Lewis ran them off with his pistols. Was that just paranoia on his part? Or could he have recognized them as agents of Wilkerson's? It's also possible they were robbers. The Natchez Trail was well known for highwaymen. Now, they could have doubled back later and attacked Lewis. Then, of course, you have the idea reported by Mrs. Grinder that Lewis and Pernia had switched clothes. Did Pernia, a man by all accounts loyal to his employer, steal his clothes? Or, as some speculated, was there a plan to send Pernia ahead dressed as Lewis to serve as a decoy until they could reach Nashville 70 miles away? Now, what became of Wilkerson? Well, he would end up standing for court-martial in 1811. This was ordered by President James Madison, who had become president in 1809 following Thomas Jefferson. It seems from his involvement with Burr, questions about his financial dealings came up. But like a Teflon-coated huckster, nothing stuck, and once again, he was put in charge of troops in the War of 1812. He would lead the disastrous campaign to take Montreal with a second court-martial and again an acquittal. This time, however, his military career was over, and he was humiliated. Yet, he still somehow managed to be named envoy to Mexico in 1821, just after Mexico had won their independence from Spain. He had been involved in a land scheme in Texas that somehow helped him land the position of envoy. However, he would die just 4 years later in 1825 in Mexico City. It would not be until 1854 that a researcher found the damning evidence proving that he was in fact a spy acting for Spain, selling numerous secrets. It was also discovered that at one point he had gone as far as to encourage Spain to admit Kentucky under the protection of Spain as a vassal. In 1787, he swore an oath of allegiance to the King of Spain. Now, if Lewis was able to even know a fraction of the treasonous acts by Wilkerson, it would not only destroy Wilkerson, but possibly lead to him being hanged for treason. This would clearly be motive, but it doesn't prove his involvement or even that Lewis didn't commit suicide. The reality is, we will never know for sure what happened to Meriwether Lewis. Did he die alone in trouble, unable to escape his personal demons? Or did the famous explorer and hero die in an attempt to expose a traitor? A traitor who continued to serve and betray his country for another 16 years. Thanks to our sources in this episode, Meriwether Lewis, The Assassination of American Hero, and The Silver Mines of Mexico by Kira Gale. Caught in the Devil's Backbone, The Mysterious Death of Meriweather Lewis on mentalfloss.com, and Meriweather Lewis's Mysterious Death in Smithsonian Magazine. This has been History is Criminal. Please join us again next time as we go to the land down under to take a look at Ned Kelly, outlaw or hero of Australia. And if you feel up to it, go ahead on Spotify and leave a comment. Now, we're going to be going ahead and moving to a weekly format, dropping new episodes every Wednesday, at least for the time being. Until then, goodbye until next time.